There we go. Can everybody hear me now? See, this happens a lot in live television. Except right now, I'd probably be getting somebody yelling in my ear like a producer, like my friend Ryan over there. One of my friends at KOCO is here. He's a producer. And we do have technical difficulties in live TV all the time. I'm really nervous about being here today. It's been a long time since I really talked to anyone about my experiences in the bombing. I guess to really bring it home to you, I'd have to talk to you about where I was at the point in my life at that time. I was a student at the University of Oklahoma, which now my cover is blown. Everyone knows exactly how old I am. I've been trying to keep that under wraps for a while. Working in TV, you don't always want everyone to know exactly how old you are, but I was a student at the University of Oklahoma at the time. That previous weekend was Easter weekend, and so I was at home for the weekend, as I usually. Norman is only 45 minutes away from my home in Edmond, where my parents had lived. And so normally on weekends, particularly if I needed money or gas in my car or on holidays, I would go home to Edmond. And that particular weekend, what I remember, because this was the last time that I saw my father, I drove at the time a Chevy Spectrum. I'm not sure if anyone really remembers what those cars looked like. My brother used to call it the Barbie car because it was a very obnoxious sort of electric blue color, and it had pink pinstripes on the side of it. And so Dad and I got in the Barbie car and went and drove around Edmond, went to a couple of shopping places, the grocery store. I think we probably to a sporting goods store. My dad loved to fish, so I imagine we probably stopped at one of those places. And I think I remember we got Chinese food, because this was on a Saturday, to take home and eat for dinner. And of course, what he always did when I was at home for the weekend was filled up the Barbie car with gas for me so that I would have plenty of gas in my car on my way back to Norman to drive around in Norman. So I actually left Sunday afternoon. We had Easter dinner like we always did, ham and all the other stuff. And at the time, I had just started working for a while at a Oklahoma City radio station. It was, I kind of landed in my lap. I was just beginning my journalism classes, just beginning to get into broadcasting, and someone suggested me for the position, and so I went over and auditioned, and I actually got the spot. It was very small, just reading news headlines during the breaks. It was a music station, so I just read headlines and things like that. But in order to do this, I had to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and drive from Norman to Oklahoma City to be at work at 4, to go through all the newspapers and look on the wires and kind of see what the big headlines of the day. And we kind of did a little entertainment stuff because, it was kind of I was on a morning show, so most of you are familiar with morning shows on radio stations. So it was a little bit of mix of, the news of the day as well as like a little bit of entertainment stories. So on Wednesday, April 19th, I did what I always did. I got up at 3 o'clock in the morning, threw something on, because it's radio, nobody knows what you look like, so you can just put on whatever you want, and drove to Oklahoma City to do the morning show. And what I remember about that morning was that the person that I normally worked with on the morning show was off. So I worked with another gentleman that day. And besides remembering that it was another person that I worked with other than my normal co-host, I remember us talking that day about how nice the weather seemed like it was going to be. It was just a really beautiful day, and as it got later into the morning, the sun came out, and it was really nice, and it was just a gorgeous day. And after I did all the news breaks, usually around 8:30, 8:45, I think is when we would start what they called the open mic segment of this particular radio station's morning show. And it was when they let people call in and, gripe about things, or some days we would pick a topic, some days there would be jokes, it just depended on what the day of the week was. And I remember we were just going along about our normal business. I don't even at this point remember what the topic was for that day, what we were talking about on the radio, but I remember, obviously it had to be around 9:02, that someone called on the line and said, "Hey, aren't you guys downtown? Did you guys feel something?" And we're like, no, I mean, of course, we're in a radio booth, you know, it's kind of soundproof walls or whatever. We hadn't heard anything, we hadn't noticed anything. And so, and of course, crazy people call in on the radio all the time. So, you know, you never really know what to think when people call in on a radio show. And then a second person called, and they said, was there some sort of gas line explosion or something? Did something happen down? Yeah, we heard this noise somewhere near downtown. And again, we kind of just said, well, you know, we'll check on that. So it was the third call that at the point that we knew that our day had changed, that this was something that, you know, we were never going to forget. A woman called, and she was sobbing, and she was hysterical. And she at first said, I think there's been an explosion at the federal courthouse. And I don't know how many of you are actually from Oklahoma. I remember the initial reports were that a lot of people thought the explosion was at the federal courthouse. And she was crying, and she was talking about, you know, there's smoke everywhere. And at that point, that's when eager young reporter kicked in. And I just said, wow, I've got to get to the bottom of this. I need to go make some phone calls. And so I remember running out of the room and trying to call the police station and trying to call the fire department, trying to make all these different calls, and none of these calls were going through. And so again, and then as my coworker was still on the air, we started getting more and more calls of people saying, you know, something's going on downtown. We don't know what it is. We think there's been an explosion. And it wasn't until, I don't even know which caller it was, but someone mentioned, no, we think it was at the federal building. To give you a little bit more perspective of why this would have not really at first made me think of my dad was the fact that we actually moved to Oklahoma City after I had already graduated from high school. I had lived in my house in Edmond for just a couple of months before I was in school in Norman. And so I had only been downtown to the federal building one time that my dad had taken us to lunch. And it wasn't until someone said the federal building that I kind of stopped for a moment and thought, well, that might be where Dad works. And it wasn't, I didn't know for sure that definitely that was probably the building where my dad worked until someone started talking about the daycare center. And the reason why this stood out to me was because my dad really liked kids, and he used to talk about looking out his window sometimes, or as he was eating lunch, or going out and seeing the kids on the playground, or out playing, or their parents dropping them off. And it was at that point that I was like, I think I need to see about my father. And of course, you do what you always do in an emergency. My first thought was to call his phone or to call the office. And once again, I'm making these phone calls, and these calls are not going through. And I finally called my mother. And my mom is she's a medical technologist. And at the time, she was working for a doctor's office. And by this time, there were news reports on television. We had turned on the TV at the radio station, and there were things coming out, and as things were trickling in, the first pictures were coming in. And I called my mother, and I asked her if she had heard from Dad. And she said, I've been trying to call, and I've been trying to call, but I can't get through. And I said, well, do you think we need to go? And she says, yeah, I think we need to go downtown and see. So I was actually closer to downtown. I was working on Northeast 23rd Street. So my mom came by and picked me up at the radio station. And what I remember is going to St. Anthony Hospital first. And at that time, it was still people running around, and still, a lot of, streets hadn't necessarily yet been blocked off. There was still a lot of chaos. And getting to the hospital, and this would begin, I guess, the first, for us in particular, 5 days of a lot of waiting and not knowing. My brother, who was in high school at the time at Edmond Memorial High School, actually ended up meeting us there at the hospital. And I remember they had people's names and things, as they were getting people accounted for, people that they had heard from or people that had been admitted to the hospital. They were writing names on boards, and we ran into one of my father's coworkers, which of course gave me hope that he was still alive. And it was one of the first shreds of hope that we hung on to. Was I ran into my father's coworker who was, I don't think I've ever seen anybody look the way that this man looked that day. I mean, he was obviously shell-shocked. I mean, his hands were trembling. I mean, he had just barely made it out of the building that day. And I asked him, have you seen my father? And he paused, and he looked at me and he said, well, your dad was supposed to be at a meeting in Tulsa at the State Department of Transportation. My dad worked for the Federal Highway Administration. And he was supposed to be meeting with some people up in Tulsa. And I'm like, okay, well, what time was he supposed to be there? And he said, well, he was supposed to be there, or at least leaving the building at 9 to get there. And so I said, well, did you see him leave? I mean, I started asking him questions, and I'm asking this man questions who's obviously, been, through the terror of his life. And again, I think he didn't want to give me the impression of what he already probably knew, was that my dad didn't make it out of the building. And he said to me, well, you know how your dad was, that he always wanted to stop and talk to people, that he would stop at everyone's desk before he left. He would say hi to the secretaries. He would do all these different things. And he says, so, I hope that today he was running on time, but you know how your dad was. And from there, I guess it just becomes sort of like this hodgepodge of different moments that I remember. We all went home that night, me, my mom, and my brother, and we didn't know anything. We hadn't heard from my dad. No one had seen him. Of course, at this point, it's all-consuming news coverage. Family members, most of our family was in Texas. We do have a few relatives that were living in Oklahoma City at the time, but we're originally from Texas, and so they had started to arrive at our house. Of course, we were getting phone call after phone call after phone call, a lot of them from reporters. And I just remember that very first night. And a lot of people talk about how you do this when you feel like you might be facing death. Well, I did this even though I wasn't facing death, about bargaining with God. And I remember my mom tried to get us to go to bed that night because, of course, none of us could go to sleep. And I could hear my mom. My brother and I have bedrooms that were right next to each other. And my mom was talking to my brother, about, whether he wanted to go to school the next day, what did he want to do. And I was sitting in my room listening to that conversation and thinking about all the things that I could promise God that I would do better if he spared my dad. And I remember that whole night that, every car I heard on the street, every light that came through the window, every noise, everything, I thought that it was my father coming home. I went through all these different scenarios of, that maybe he's somewhere and he has amnesia. He made it out of the building, but he can't remember who he is, and in a few days he's going to be here. Or, he's in a hospital and he doesn't remember what his name is, and, when he remembers who he is, he's going to come home. And so I remember just that whole night, just really, really, doing a lot of praying. I mean, I don't think I've ever prayed so hard in my entire life for something not to be true. And I know it's a cliche that people say that, going through these things are very surreal, but that was definitely the whole time, just having this really hard time believing that this had happened to our country, that this had happened to Oklahoma City, and that this had happened to my family. I think the one thing that maybe I could talk a little bit about as well is that I also learned from that just how very different people grieve just from within my own family, or how they handle stressful situations like that. For example, my brother went to school every single day that my dad was missing, that we didn't know where he was. Every single day he got up, got dressed, and went to school. My mom was in, I have to say, the one thing I have to say is my mom is one of the, I admire her more than anybody, is one of the strongest people that I've ever known, because at the time, her mother was living with us. She had rapid onset dementia. And so her mother was there in our house, and she was in a wheelchair, she couldn't get around, and her memory was gone. And so I opted to stay at home when I could with my grandmother while my mom did all the things that they were asking people to do at that time, such as getting dental records, and of course the church was set up for all the victims' family members, and she would go over there every single day. And we had some family members or some friends that would come and sit with my grandmother sometimes. I didn't go to school. In fact, I missed the whole the last month of the semester. I missed finals. I missed all kinds of stuff that year after the bombing. It was a lot of you probably remember the memorial service that President Clinton came to Oklahoma City, and it was that weekend. And we chose not to go as a family, to not go. Because even though at that point in time it looked bleak, they had stopped looking for survivors, and it was no longer search and rescue, it was recovery. We still just felt like if we went to that memorial service, it was giving up. It was giving up that hope. And I think it was the following Monday that is when they officially identified my father's remains. And my mom went with her brother. One of her brothers from Houston was here, and they went. And I remember she came back to the house, and she told us separately. She told my brother on his own, and then she told me. And I wish I could tell you at what point that it really set in, what had happened, because I really don't remember. There's so much of that was such a blur to me that I don't remember. I remember going to the funeral. My dad was actually from Eastern Texas, and so his funeral was held in Eastern Texas. I remember being there. I remember the dress I wore. But other than that, I really remember just kind of just being in shock and just not. And I remember too, and I guess this comes from being, obviously I wasn't a child, but I was still kind of in my formative years. I was still dependent on my parents. And I remember all these different thoughts going on. At one point I even thought about quitting school, because I thought, well, maybe I need to work now. Maybe we're going to be poor. Maybe we'll lose our house. My dad had been, such a provider and had been, such a dominant person in our household. I just was a tremendous amount of fear about what was going to happen next. I really don't think a lot of people thought we were going to stay in Oklahoma City, and I was actually surprised when my mom did make the choice to remain living here. As far as the trials, to kind of skip ahead, it's kind of also hard for me to really remember a lot of that, because you have to realize I was still in school. I was trying to, and I think one thing that I can convey to people about how things like this affect your life, and I've probably spent the last 10 years or so doing this, is that your life becomes focused after a while on trying to make things return to normal, on trying to just do things the way you did them before, to try and just, have the same ambitions, have the same hopes and dreams. And my dad was a very positive and optimistic person, and so I knew that I had to continue on and do the things that he would have wanted me to do, and that was my mom's hope for us. And so during those years, as a journalist, it was always a precarious thing, because I was interested in the media aspect of the trials, and I was interested in the people who were covering it, and I was interested in the reports and what have you, but it was also very kind of painful to see it and be surrounded by it constantly. And I was still in school. I graduated actually a year after I should have, because I had so many incompletes and bad grades from the last few months of school after the bombing, which was really hard for me because I was a National Merit Scholar, and I had never, had problems in school. I had never had failing grades. I had never, I felt very like I had disappointed a lot of people. And one thing I want to say, I'm very thankful to the Memorial Foundation, all the people that helped me finally get my education completed, as well as my brother. But my family, we kind of stayed away from McVeigh's trial. We didn't really, we followed it, but we weren't really all that actively involved. We didn't go to Denver for any of this stuff because everyone remembers the trial was held in Denver. I did go, and I did give an impact statement in the Terry Nichols trial, at the end of the trial before the sentencing. And because they had asked me to do it, they had asked the prosecutors that they felt that it was important for them to see some of the people, the kids who lost parents, to see the impact that it had on families. And I remember just being very, very, in awe, first of all. Again, the journalist side of me coming out, in awe of all the satellite trucks and the various reporters and the news anchors and people were there, and but also of the magnitude of everything. When they escorted us, who were witnesses, into the courtroom, you could see the snipers on the top of the courthouse building because they were so concerned about the security aspect at the time. And the one thing I can say about that experience is what I was struck by more than anything, because I was sitting maybe as far as that seat right in front of me, that close to Terry Nichols when I was on the witness stand, struck by just how ordinary looking this man was. And same thing with Timothy McVeigh. These were guys you would see in Walmart. These are guys that you could walk down any street in Oklahoma City and see somebody that's just like that, similar in dress and, experience and background. And I think it goes to very much of what we sometimes try to believe that evil is. We have this picture of monsters and demons and, people who are larger than life. And, it's probably not good for me to state my opinion a lot because I am a journalist, but I will say that, I feel like what they did was evil. And for me to see that just ordinary person there, it was very unbelievable to me. One of the things that I talked about when I testified at that trial, and I think that this really is a story that kind of gives the whole impact of what I feel like I lost after the bombing, besides the fact that my dad was gone. My dad was an only child. My grandmother was a woman who was very religious, very, very strong in her faith, took kids in the neighborhood to Sunday school, that whole kind of thing. She was married to a minister. She had my father very late in life. She thought she couldn't have children. And I remember as a little girl, her telling me this story of how she had prayed and prayed and prayed for a child. And she was a teacher and was trying to come to terms with maybe the fact that God just intended her to have children through her job as a teacher rather than her own biological children. And so my dad and my grandmother had a very close bond. He called her every single day. And after the bombing, the last time I had seen my grandmother was at my dad's funeral. My mom had determined that we should go see her during the summer. Just, we should spend a few weeks with her, see how she's doing, try and keep her company. My brother and I drove 8 hours to East Texas. We get to her house, and we knock on the door, and she comes to the door, as my grandmother would always do, very sweet, friendly. She's got her apron on. She was that kind of a woman, wears the apron, and she invites us in and, asks us if we're hungry. And it's not until about maybe 5 or 6 minutes in this conversation that we're having with my grandmother, who is being very sweet and very welcoming to us, that we realize she doesn't know who we are. And my brother is sitting there and talking to her and trying to get her to remember who we are. Now, she's doing everything else normally. You know, she's cooking, she's taking care of herself, but she has no idea who we are. And my brother and I were so upset by this development that we called my mother immediately. We stayed the night and then drove back home. And for me, my grandmother was my last, because my dad didn't have any brothers or sisters, real link to my father. And later doctors pretty much said that they felt like the shock and the stress coupled with her age, that it was her way of dealing, blocking us out as though it was her way of dealing with what had happened. And she pretty much deteriorated a whole lot after that. And I think that that was one of the things that probably hurt me more than anything. You know, I miss my dad, and I came to terms with him being gone, but when I lost my grandmother in that way, and knowing what it was a direct result of, it was really, really, really hard to deal with. One thing that was mentioned in my bio, and I'm going to talk on that very briefly and then let you guys ask some questions, because I can talk forever, as any producer, like Ryan knows, has to rap me to get me to be quiet. I did attend Timothy McVeigh's execution. It was a very widely misreported event, which all goes back into, we talk very much in the world of television of how we are supposed to be professional communicators, but sometimes we're the poorest communicators. I had actually come back to Oklahoma City with a photographer, and we had decided to try. I'd seen some other reporters who had done like firsthand accounts of different things. Of course, you probably now, it's very common to see anchors do stories about their pregnancies or about cancer, if they're affected by cancer or whatever. And I'd seen a story that someone had done about their family being immigrants. And at the time, I was really starting to feel like I was ready to maybe talk more, because I didn't talk to a lot of people about my experiences at that time. I was actually working for the ABC affiliate in Little Rock, Arkansas at this time. And we decided, you know, along with the producer and a photographer that was a really good friend of mine, that we would maybe try and kind of document the experience that I had in Oklahoma City. And it happened to be the same year that they were going to execute Timothy McVeigh. And at the time, this is when people in TV had a lot of money to spend before the recession, and they decided, well, you know, we'll put together these really good stories, and then you confront them from Terre Haute and do talk back with our anchors and for the morning show and for the other shows. But it somehow got misreported that I was covering the actual execution, which snowballed into this really, really interesting string of events. You probably hear people in showbiz talk all the time about celebrities that say you should never read your own press. At the time, there were so many things that were written about me that were so awful and so mean-spirited, and I was young. I was very early in my career, and I was, you know, immature, and I tried to respond to some of the criticism, which I now realize in retrospect was not the best idea to do. You know, now we see all the time that when people do something that grabs national headlines, because when this was reported that way, I began getting calls from people all over the country, and you know, people that were interested in the story.